Before we dive in, drop a quick hi in the comments. It may seem small, but trust me, it really helps YouTube share this story with more sci-fi fans like us. I'd love to see who's watching.
The crystal ballroom of Solfege Prime had been built to impress, but Edmund Russell had no attention to spare for vaulted ceilings or holographic banners, or the light of 3 stars breaking across 34 species, dressed in their finest. He stood near the 3rd pillar from the eastern entrance and looked at the room. 4 days ago, Tharvex had shown him the transmission. The being who had held the galaxy together for 15 years without open war. The 134 species had gathered here to celebrate. Lord Peace, they called him. Half title, half expectation. The message had appeared on his private channel. No clearance request, no warning. It had simply been there. A figure of metal and shadow filled the projection, voice stripped of anything resembling warmth. Join us willingly, or be broken. Your precious peace ends today. Tharvex had let it play once, straight through, then stood behind his desk, with his long fingers pressed flat against its surface, holding himself in that controlled stillness Russell knew too well. There had been no hesitation. No. That had been the entire reply. Russell had not doubted that for a second. What he doubted, what still refused to settle into anything that made sense, was the channel it had come through. Quantum encrypted. Personal. Accessible to fewer beings in the galaxy than Russell had fingers on one hand. Around him, recycled air carried alien perfume and diplomatic caution in equal measure. The banners rippled. The stars burned overhead in fractured light. The ballroom glittered with power, ceremony, and the kind of smiles that never meant safety. Russell kept watching the room. He had contacted Severus within the hour, told him to watch the ceremony feed and have assets ready. Severus had not asked why. That was why Russell trusted him. Security had been ramped up. Russell had walked the perimeter himself that morning, checked the sensor grids, the phase disruption barriers, the positioning of the council guard details. Everything looked correct. Everything looked exactly the way it should look to someone who had been told to make it look correct. Tharvex stood at the central podium now, his pale Arconian features composed, his voice carrying the particular cadence he used for moments he considered historic. The words about coexistence and shared futures moved through the ballroom, and the assembled dignitaries received them the way they always did, with the practiced warmth of people who had been at peace long enough to forget what the alternative felt like. Russell kept watching. He did not know what he was looking for. That was the problem, and the discipline simultaneously. When you know a threat exists, but not its shape or its vector or its timing, you stop looking for specific things and start looking for anything that does not belong. A sound that arrives a half-beat wrong. A body that stops moving when the bodies around it are still moving. A gap in the room's natural texture that should not be a gap. He moved his attention across the exits, the northern doors, the southern service access, the gallery above. 3 directions that a threat could use if a threat knew the room. He looked at the ceiling coverage and the gaps in it, and the way the sensor grids had been positioned, and whether the positioning made sense from a security standpoint, or from the standpoint of someone who needed the positioning to look like it made sense. He looked at the council security detail, their spacing, their sight lines, the direction their attention moved, and whether it moved the way trained attention moves, or the way attention moves when it has been directed somewhere specific to keep it from moving somewhere else. He found nothing. That did not mean nothing was there. Tharvex said the word unity, and the ballroom responded with a sound like approval, and Russell was still scanning, still reading the texture of the room, when the lights died. Complete darkness. One beat of silence so total it felt pressurized. Then the air cracked. Phase displacement was a sound Russell had never heard before tonight, and would never forget after. Like reality folding at the seams, it came from multiple points simultaneously. The northern exit, the stage flanks, the gallery above. The Vorath did not enter the ballroom. They arrived in it, black and crimson, sleek and augmented, already moving with the mechanical certainty of soldiers who had run this operation in simulation until the variables disappeared. Russell was already cutting through the crowd toward the podium, moving with the controlled violence of a man who knows that running in darkness causes collisions, and collisions cause delays. He used shoulders and elbows, and the gaps between panicking bodies, and he did not stop. A neural whip discharged somewhere to his left. He heard a body drop. The stage was 12 meters, then 8, then 4. The shot came from the gallery. One round, clean. The sound of it was almost polite against the backdrop of screaming. Russell's gaze cut to the Arconian side of the room, something there not moving, not reacting. Tharvex folded at the podium, not thrown back, not dramatic, just a sudden absence of the uprightness that had defined him. Russell crossed the last 2 meters and caught him before he hit the floor. The Chancellor's weight was wrong, already wrong. Russell went down with him, one knee on the crystal floor, Tharvex's head against his chest. The broadcast drone above the stage held its position with mechanical indifference, its lens catching everything. Tharvex looked up at him with the expression of a man who had calculated the odds of this moment and accepted them some time ago. His mouth moved. Russell lowered his head. Whatever Lord Peace said at the end, he said it only to the one person in the galaxy who had taken the threat seriously. Russell stayed there for 3 seconds. 3 was all he allowed himself. Then he pressed 2 fingers to Tharvex's neck and confirmed what he already knew and stood up. The Council security team hit him from 3 sides simultaneously. They were not Vorath. They were Council Guard. Sale Rune's people in the chain. Russell understood that with cold clarity as the restraints locked around his wrists. The accusation came fast and rehearsed. Human incompetence, security failure, the representative's negligence. Someone had to be the explanation, and the explanation had been chosen before the lights died. Russell did not resist. Resistance here cost him everything and gained him nothing. He let them turn him and push him toward the corridor, and as they moved him through the chaos, he looked back once across the ballroom. Sale Rune stood near the western pillar, still, composed, watching Russell being removed with the expression of a man watching a plan execute correctly. Russell looked at him for exactly as long as it took to confirm what he already knew. Then he faced forward and walked. The detention corridor was cold and gray and built for function. They pushed him into a holding cell, and the door sealed, and Russell stood in the center of the space, and breathed once, slowly, and began to work. His left eye moved in a way that had nothing to do with vision. The retinal implant was a piece of hardware that had cost more favors than he cared to count, and had been embedded by a UED field surgeon in a back room on a station that did not officially exist. The scan protocols used by Council security were thorough. They were not thorough enough. He began to compile. Station layout from memory. Vorath entry vectors from what he had observed in the ballroom. Guard rotation pattern from the footsteps outside the door. Force strength estimates from the number of displacement events he had counted during the breach. He built the picture, and he began to transmit. Across the station, in the ruined crystal ballroom, Tech Lord Veracun materialized. His hologram filled the space from floor to vaulted ceiling, rendering him in cold blue light above the bodies and the blood and the shattered dignity of 15 years. His voice did not boom. It did not need to. It was the voice of a man explaining something to someone who no longer had a choice. The age of weak coexistence is over. The Vorath Dominion now rules this galaxy. Submit, or die. The image held for a moment on Tharvex's body, where it lay at the base of the podium. Then the feed cut. Across the ballroom, a Vorath soldier raised one hand to the side of his helmet. A small gesture, the kind of movement that meant someone on the other end of a channel had just finished speaking. He looked at Sail Rune. Raised his weapon. Sail Rune saw it coming in the last half-second, and understood that the Vorath did not make alliances. They made instruments, and instruments were discarded the moment the work was done. He did not have time to say anything. The shot snapped him backward. He fell among the dignitaries he had betrayed, in the blood of the Chancellor he had killed. He had been promised a seat at a new table. He died on the floor of the old one. In the detention corridor, Russell watched it on the wall monitor as it played across every channel. He did not move. His expression never changed. He filed Varakoon's vocal patterns and cadence the same way he had filed Sail Rune's face and kept building his transmission. At UED Orbital Command, General Marcus Severus had been watching the feed since Russell told him to watch it. He had seen the lights die. He had seen something arrive in a room that every protocol in the galaxy said nothing could reach. He had watched Russell cut through the crowd toward the podium with the grim efficiency of a man who already knew he would not be fast enough. He had watched Tharvex fall. Lord Peace. That was what the diplomatic corps had called him for a decade. The being who had looked at centuries of war and decided, with the full force of his considerable intelligence, that it did not have to continue. Who had built something fragile and real and worth protecting from nothing but will and words, and the stubborn refusal to accept that conflict was the natural state of existence. Severus had met him twice. Both times Tharvex had treated him with the particular courtesy that brilliant people extend to soldiers. Respectful, genuine, slightly puzzled, as though he understood the necessity of men like Severus, but could not quite map their interior landscape. He watched the Chancellor's body lying at the base of the podium. Moments later, he listened as Varakoon's voice filled every channel in the galaxy. The room around Severus was silent. His staff knew what a man looked like when you did not speak to him. The feed cut to static. Severus picked up the command channel. One order. Flat and without inflection, the way he gave every order that he intended to be the last word on a subject. The fleet moved. The Vorath who came for Russell knew exactly who he was. They opened the cell door without announcement and stood inside the threshold and looked at him the way professionals look at a problem they have been given time to solve. Russell looked back. They knew his name, his rank, his tenure on the council. They knew he had been Tharvex's closest confidant. They knew he had contacted UED Orbital Command before the ceremony. Sail Rune had been thorough, Russell noted. The questions were precise. UED fleet disposition, orbital command structure, human military capability, response timelines. They were not asking randomly. They were filling gaps in intelligence they already partially held, which told Russell more about Vorath preparation than anything they said directly. He answered carefully, enough to seem cooperative, enough to seem like a man calculating his survival odds and making reasonable decisions. Everything he said was either publicly available or specifically constructed to be useless in the field. Aboard his flagship, Severus pulled up every scrap of intelligence available on the Vorath. 4 days ago, within the hour of Russell's call, he had started collecting. He had not waited to see if the threat was real. Russell did not make calls like that without reason, and Severus had learned a long time ago that the cost of taking Russell seriously was always lower than the cost of not doing so. He had pulled every allied contact he had, called in favors from species whose sensor networks reached places human arrays did not, and tasked his analysts with everything they could find on a dominion that nobody in this galaxy had formally encountered before. What they had built in 4 days was incomplete. It was enough. What came in now from the ceremony feed and the first wave of battlefield telemetry did not complete the picture. It sharpened it. Patterns in Vorath movement, response timing that looked too synchronized to be ordinary command relay, enough to suggest a system behind it, though not yet enough to name it with certainty. Then he waited for the next transmission. It didn't come. He watched the feed indicator for a long moment. In 15 years of working with Russell, he had learned to read the man's silences the way other people read words. A voluntary cut looked different from an interrupted one. He knew which this was. He looked at his boarding team commanders. Finding Russell was now the priority. He said it once, and the room shifted around it. In the cell, the Vorath were still questioning Russell when the scan began. Then something changed. The exchange stopped mid-line. Both officers went still, listening to something he could not hear. One of them left. The other stayed by the door and did not speak again. Russell kept his face neutral and waited. The door opened, and Russell felt the change in the room, the way you feel a drop in temperature. Something large and certain, accustomed to obedience, had entered the space. Tech Lord Varakun did not announce himself. The interrogation officer left without being told to. The door stayed open. Varakun looked at Russell the way a technician looks at equipment that has been operating outside its parameters. He crossed the cell in 3 steps and crouched to Russell's eye level and studied him for a moment. Then he reached out with 2 fingers, long, gray, the joints reinforced with subdermal augmentation that showed as faint ridges beneath the skin, and pressed them against Russell's left temple with the certainty of someone who had done this before and expected it to work. Russell felt the augmentation activate before he understood its purpose. A focused signal drove into the orbital cavity, precise and controlled, designed for exactly this kind of intrusion. It was not blunt force, and it did not strike like ordinary violence. It found the implant the way a key finds a lock, and once it did, it began to work. The pain that followed was not like other pain. Russell had been shot. He had been burned. He had taken damage in a dozen engagements across 2 decades of service that had left its record permanently on his body. He knew the difference between pain the mind could compartmentalize and pain the nervous system simply refused to negotiate with. He knew where his threshold was. The sound Russell made was not voluntary. It tore out of him before he could stop it. Then his body shut down. Darkness took him. He came back to sound first. Ventilation, distant footsteps, the low, steady hum of something mechanical beyond the door. His face felt wrong, padded, covered, held in place by something that ran from his brow to the bridge of his nose and wrapped around to the back of his skull. He could feel the slight chemical coolness of it against what was underneath, and he did not reach up to check because he already knew. No pain. That meant something had been applied, the blindfold, most likely. Whatever it was doing its work with the same clinical efficiency the Vorath applied to everything else. They needed him alive. He lay still and took inventory, hands unrestrained, back against the cell floor, body intact, below the neck. Breathing steady, though his chest moved more carefully than usual, the reflex of a nervous system still negotiating with what had been done to it. He stayed there for a long moment. The dark was not going to change. No implant, no vision, no light coming through at any angle or intensity. For now, there was nothing he could do. He moved on. He put his hands flat on the floor, found the wall, and pushed himself upright. He listened to the ventilation, the footsteps, and the low background vibration beyond the door, and began to build his map. 2 guards outside. The sound around them wasn't identical, a slight asymmetry that told him one was running older hardware. Beyond them, the corridor felt different now, tighter, more deliberate in its movement. Something in the station had shifted. Reinforcements had been repositioned, or orders redistributed. Either way, the rhythm had changed. Russell straightened his back against the wall and set his hands on his thighs and waited. He had given them nothing they could use. He intended to keep it that way. The first impact came through the structure, distant, controlled, and not part of the station's normal operation. Russell tilted his head slightly and listened. Moments later, the fleet came out of faster than light in a wall. Severus did not slow the approach. He came in hard and direct, hitting the station before the Vorath could fully stabilize their defenses. The Vorath had partially reconfigured the station's external defenses, but the system was not yet stable. Defense fire crossed in uneven patterns as they tried to bring it into alignment, and Severus hit that window before it closed. The first exchange was short and violent, and boarding craft detached in its wake. They drove in fast and low along the station hull, and the boarding teams were already preparing their charges before the Vorath could fully respond. The first doors came down. Boots hit corridor floors, heavy and deliberate, the sound of people already committed to the fight. The station's lighting was partial and uneven from the Vorath reconfiguration, but the boarding teams moved through it without breaking stride. They had trained for worse, and they were not slowing down now. The Vorath had been told humans were dangerous. They were about to learn it in close quarters. The first corridor cost them. The Vorath did not fight the way the boarding teams had trained against. They did not hold positions or exchange fire with the tactical logic of soldiers reading a battlefield in real time. They moved like a single organism, one unit pulling back as another closed from the flank, pressure applied and released in precise patterns. That level of coordination suggested direct communication. Sergeant Davo Rice, a boarding team commander on the eastern approach, watched two of his people go down in a crossfire they could not possibly have seen coming. He understood what it meant. He made the decision in the time it took to drag the nearest body into cover. He pulled his remaining people back 12 meters and blew the ceiling junction. The structural collapse bought them the corridor, killed two Vorath, and temporarily disrupted the sightlines that had been coordinating the flanking elements. It also buried the route they had come in on. There was no going back. Rice looked at his people. They looked back. Nobody said anything. The math was obvious, and the direction was forward. They moved. Other teams were pushing through the northern and western approaches. The breach spread wide enough that the Vorath could not concentrate their response without leaving gaps elsewhere. The gaps were small. The boarding teams found every one of them. Human adaptability in a corridor was not a tactical concept. It was a biological fact, the accumulated reflex of a species that had been solving the problem of how to kill things in enclosed spaces for the entirety of its existence. They picked up Vorath phase disruptors from the bodies as they went, worked out the trigger geometry by feel, and turned them on live targets. The weapons worked exactly as well in human hands as they had in Vorath ones, which was information the Vorath had apparently not considered worth accounting for. The node was in the northern hub. Every team was already moving toward it, but the Vorath knew that too, and had concentrated accordingly. In the detention block, the battle was a language Russell was reading through the hull. Breach charges had a specific percussion, sharp, directional, the echo telling him distance and approximate corridor width. Human weapons had a different report than Vorath phase disruptors, the latter carrying a frequency that resonated differently against the station's metal walls. He tracked both, mapped the engagement lines by sound, and cross-referenced them against the station layout he had been carrying in his memory for 15 years. The eastern approach team was pushing hard. The northern team was close to the node, but angling wrong. They were defaulting to the main corridor junction, when the service passage 2 levels down would put them directly underneath the node room, with one sealed door between them and the target instead of 4. They did not know about the service passage. It was not on the standard layout schematics. Russell knew about it because he had walked this station for 15 years, and because 3 years ago, a maintenance issue had required him to accompany a repair crew through exactly that route. The Vorath outside his cell had thinned. He could hear it in the spacing of the footsteps, the augmentation hum more distant than it had been. Units pulled toward the fighting. Standard defensive reallocation. Predictable. He put his back against the wall and his feet flat on the floor and waited for the sound that would tell him His people had found the block. It came 11 minutes later. Not a breach charge. A shaped cut. Clean and controlled. The sound of a tool rather than a weapon. Spec Ops. Severus had sent the quiet ones. The node room was the hardest fight in the station. The Vorath defending it were their best. Tighter, faster, and more coordinated than anything the boarding teams had faced so far. They had fortified the room with portable shield emitters and overlapping fields of fire, and they had clearly been told that the node did not fall regardless of cost. Rice's element hit them from the eastern corridor. The western team hit the shield emitters with captured phase disruptors on settings they had worked out from battlefield observation. Certain configurations interfered with the emitters from the outside. It took 3 attempts to find it. The 3rd attempt worked. The room opened up. What followed was not elegant. It was human boarding teams in close quarters, with Vorath soldiers, who were still the most dangerous individual fighters they had encountered, and it was brutal. Loud. Fast. Decided by margins too small to plan for. The node stood at the center of the room, a column of black architecture. Rice reached it with the charge he had been carrying since the first corridor, and set it with the care of a man who understood there would not be a second attempt. The detonation was contained, precise. The node came apart from the inside. The effect moved through the station like a wave. Vorath soldiers across every corridor lost whatever had been coordinating them. It did not kill them, but the precision fell away, and units that had moved as one became individuals, making their own decisions under fire. Against humans in corridors, that was a different calculation. The boarding teams felt the shift before they understood it, as engagements turned decisive and positions began to collapse. The Spec Ops team that cut through the detention block door found 7 cells. 6 empty. 1 occupied. Russell was sitting upright against the wall, hands flat on his thighs, blindfold in place. The team leader, a compact man named Okafor, who had been briefed that Russell was the priority equal to the node, moved into the cell and stopped. Russell's head turned toward him. "Russell," Okafor said. Russell listened for a fraction of a second, then nodded once. "Okafor," he said. "You favor your left side when you're moving tactically. I noticed it the first time you trained with the Council security detail. Old injury or a habit?" Okafor looked at the blindfold and said nothing for a moment. "Both," he said. Russell put one hand on the floor and stood without assistance. He was steady. The blindfold was dark, with old chemical staining at the edges, the medicine long since absorbed. He held out his right hand. Okafor put a sidearm in it. Russell's fingers ran the weapon's geometry in 3 seconds. Grip, trigger, safety position, charge indicator by texture. He chambered it and held it at his side. His left hand he held out open, palm up. Okafor put his hand in it. Russell's grip was not the grip of a man who needed guidance. It was the grip of a man who needed a fixed point to orient from. There was a difference, and Okafor felt it immediately. "Veracun is probably in the crystal ballroom," Russell said. "He's likely pulled his remaining force around the perimeter, weighted toward the stage. The main doors are sealed, but the same disruptor settings your people used on the shield emitters should break them. There's also a maintenance access point on the northeastern wall, corridor level. It doesn't appear on Council schematics. It opens into the gallery above the ballroom floor." Okafor stared at him. "You have been in this cell for hours," he said. Russell's expression did not change. "I know the station very well," Russell said. "It breathes. You can hear it, once you learn how to listen." They moved. Russell navigated by memory and sound, and the fixed point of Okafor's hand on his shoulder. His own choice, his own terms, a tool rather than a support. Twice he redirected the team away from the routes they defaulted to, and both times the alternative proved faster and cleaner. The Vorath they encountered without the network were dangerous and determined, and not enough. The node's death had changed the arithmetic of the station, and the boarding teams were collecting the result corridor by corridor. The northeastern maintenance access was exactly where Russell said it would be. They reached the crystal ballroom gallery without being detected. Below them, the room was unrecognizable. The crystal tables shattered or overturned. The holographic banners dead. The transpersteel ceiling cracked in 2 places, where something had impacted it from outside during the breach approach. Tharvex's body was still at the base of the podium. No one had moved him. Varakun stood at the center of the ballroom floor, with his remaining force arranged around him exactly as Russell had predicted. He was not panicking. He was not retreating. He was a tech lord of the Vorath Dominion, and he was standing in the room he had taken and waiting for. Whatever came next, with the cold patience of a being who had not yet fully updated his assessment of the situation. Russell's hand found the gallery railing. His head moved in small increments, reading the room by the augmentation hum of the Vorath below, by the air currents, by the acoustic map he had built from hours of listening to a station breathe. He told Okafor exactly where each Vorath soldier was standing. Okafor looked at his team. Then he looked at the blind man, holding the railing with one hand and a sidearm with the other. Russell's face was already turned toward the floor below, toward the point where the augmentation hum was strongest, toward Varakun. "On your call," Okafor said quietly. Russell's grip tightened on the railing. They breached. The gallery gave them the first 3 seconds. 3 seconds in a room full of augmented soldiers was enough if you used them correctly. Okafor's team used them correctly. They came off the gallery railing in a controlled drop, weapons already oriented toward the positions Russell had mapped from above, and hit the ballroom floor, moving. Simultaneously, the main doors came down from outside. Breach charges placed by the boarding teams who had been fighting through the station's western corridors and had arrived at the ballroom threshold 30 seconds ahead of schedule because the node's death had turned what should have been a grinding approach into something closer to a pursuit. Varakun's force had been arranged for a single direction of threat. They got 2. Without whatever had been coordinating them, the response was still fast. Individual Vorath soldiers were still among the most dangerous fighters in the station, but fast and coordinated were different things, and the difference showed immediately. Units that would have collapsed the flanks in the first seconds instead made individual decisions that created gaps, and the boarding teams and Okafor's people poured through the gaps with the focused aggression of soldiers who had been fighting toward this room since they hit the station hull. The crystal ballroom became something it had never been designed to be, a battlefield. Russell came off the railing last. He did not jump blind. He took the railing in both hands and went over it controlled, dropping the distance he had calculated from the sound of his teammates landing, and hit the floor in a combat crouch with his sidearm up and his head already turning. The ballroom resolved around him in sound and air pressure and the specific frequencies of augmentation technology operating at combat intensity, a cluster of signatures, distinct enough to give him position and movement. He had been building this map since the gallery. He did not need to update it. He needed to move through it. The first Vorath came at him from the left, drawn by the sound of his landing, moving with the precision of a soldier who had fought humans before and knew to close distance fast and not give them room to think. Russell heard the weight shift 2 steps before the commitment and was already turning into it, inside the reach of the phase disruptor, before it could be brought to bear. And what he did in the next 4 seconds was not something that required eyes. The Vorath went down. Russell was already moving toward the next signature. He did not chase. He read the room and found the angles where the fight would come to him, and he was there when it arrived. A blind man in a ballroom full of augmented soldiers should have been a casualty in the first 30 seconds. Russell was a casualty in the way a detonation is a casualty, something that removes itself from the equation by removing everything around it first. The Vorath he encountered did not understand what they were fighting until it was too late to adjust. By then, it did not matter. Varakun read the room with the cold clarity of a being who had commanded enough engagements to know when one was unrecoverable. The node was gone. His force was engaged on two fronts without coordination. The humans were not fighting the way his tactical model said humans fought. They were faster in close quarters, more aggressive, less predictable than his models accounted for. The ballroom was lost. The engagement was lost. The war wasn't lost. The war had not yet begun in any meaningful sense. Varakun was one tech lord, and there were others. The force he had brought here was not the full measure of the Dominion. He needed the command deck. He needed to re-establish contact and coordinate the next phase before the humans consolidated their position on the station. The engagement here was a setback. Setbacks were recoverable. He moved. 4 of his most heavily augmented soldiers formed a perimeter around him, and they pushed toward the northeastern corridor, the route to the command deck, the route he had already identified as the cleanest exit from the ballroom. They moved with purpose, without hesitation. Varakun did not believe he was losing. He believed he was adapting. Russell heard Varakun move, not guessed. Heard the specific augmentation signature he had cataloged in the detention cell, the complex layered hum of a tech lord's modifications running at full output, distinct from every other signature in the room, the way a voice is distinct from noise. He had been tracking it since the gallery, through the drop and the landing, and the 3 Vorath he had put down since. That signature had been a fixed point in his map of the room, and now it was moving toward the northeastern corridor, and Russell knew what was in the northeastern corridor because he knew this station. He did not follow. Following was the wrong geometry. He cut. 15 years of walking Solfeg. Prime's corridors gave him the angle, a route through the eastern edge of the ballroom that would bring him to the northeastern corridor mouth before Varakun's perimeter reached it. He moved fast, and he moved clean, and twice he stepped around debris he could not see because the acoustic return from his own footfalls told him it was there. Okafor saw what Russell was doing from across the ballroom. He pulled 2 people and went wide to the left, toward the other side of the corridor mouth, without being told to. He had only been watching Russell for seconds, but it was enough to understand what he was seeing. The corridor mouth had 2 approaches. Russell took one. Okafor's people took the other. Varakun walked his perimeter into a corner. He looked at the 2 humans blocking the corridor mouth, looked back at the ballroom where the sounds of his remaining force being systematically dismantled were becoming less frequent in the specific way that meant the dismantling was nearly complete. Then he looked at Russell. Russell was standing at the corridor mouth with a sidearm at his side, and his head turned at the slight angle of a man, orienting by sound. The blindfold was dark and still. His face was calm in the way that empty rooms are calm, not peaceful, not resolved, simply absent of anything that was not necessary. Varakun raised his weapon. The shot went wide. Russell had heard the targeting adjustment in the shift of Varakun's weight, the slight forward transfer that preceded the arm coming up, the barely perceptible change in the augmentation hum as the weapon system powered to fire. And he had moved before the decision to fire was fully executed. Not far. Enough. He closed the distance. Varakun was larger, augmented, stronger by any measurable standard. He fought with the precision of a being whose modifications had been designed for exactly this kind of engagement. And in the first seconds, he was winning in the way that a superior tool wins against an inferior one when the metrics are straightforward. Russell did not fight on straightforward metrics. He fought in the specific way that a man fights when he has nothing left to lose, and 60 years of knowing exactly where bodies break. He absorbed what he had to absorb and did not stop. He took damage that should have slowed him and used the momentum of it instead of fighting it. He found the left leg, the asymmetric one, the one whose augmentation hum had been slightly off since the detention cell, the weakness Varakun did not know he had mapped, and he broke it. Varakun went down. On the floor, he was still dangerous, and Russell knew it, and did not give him the seconds he needed to become dangerous again. What Russell did next was not something that required description. It required only that it be done completely. Okafor's people arrived at the edge of it. They did not intervene. There was nothing left to intervene in. When it was over, Russell stood. He was breathing hard. His left side was damaged in ways that would need attention. His hands were wet. He stood with his head slightly bowed and his sidearm at his side, and didn't move for a moment. Then he turned. Not toward Okafor, not toward the sounds of the boarding teams finishing the last of the Vorath in the ballroom behind him. He turned toward the place he had known, with the precise certainty of a man who had held someone there and never forgotten it. The base of the podium. He crossed the ballroom floor slowly. The sounds of the fight behind him were tapering, isolated, terminal. The last notes of something concluding. His boots found the step at the base of the stage, and he stopped. He did not crouch. He did not reach down. He stood at the edge of where Tharvex had fallen, and was still and quiet, in the way that only people who have run out of things to do with their hands are quiet. Okafor watched from across the room, and did not speak, and did not move toward him. Nobody did. The ballroom was silent for the first time since the lights had died. They found Rice near the node room. He had made it through the fight, through the corridor collapse he had called down on his own approach route, through the node room and everything inside it. He had made it to within sight of the ballroom doors before something caught him in the final exchange with the last Vorath perimeter element. He was sitting against the wall with his back straight and his legs out in front of him and his weapon still in his hand, which was the way soldiers who knew they were not getting up again chose to sit. Okafor stood over him for a moment. Then he moved on. There was still work to do, and Reese would have told him to keep moving. The station was secured, but the cost made the word feel hollow. Solfege Prime breathed again, its systems partial, its corridors scarred, its crystal ballroom a ruin that no amount of reconstruction would make into what it had been before the attack. The holographic banners were gone. The transparasteel ceiling was cracked in 2 places. The crystal tables were fragments underfoot. Nobody celebrated. There was nothing in the boarding teams that wanted to celebrate. They had taken the station back, and the station felt like a grave, and celebration would have been a kind of lie that none of them had the energy for. They gathered their dead, tended their wounded, and secured the surviving Vorath with the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood the work did not stop just because the shooting had. The surviving council representatives had been moved to a secondary conference room on the station's upper level, smaller than the ballroom, functional, the kind of room used for working sessions rather than ceremonies. They sat or stood or arranged themselves according to whatever posture their biology used for shock and uncertainty. They were leaderless in a way that went beyond the absence of a single individual. Tharvex had not merely led the council, he had been the architecture of it, the intelligence and the will and the particular quality of belief that had made 34 species decide, 15 years ago, that coexistence was worth the work it required. Without Lord Peace, the room did not know what it was. Russell came in last. He was still in council robes. The robes were ruined. The blindfold was dark at the edges, and his face, above and below it, carried the specific stillness of a man who had spent everything he had and not yet decided whether to look for more. Okafor's hand was not on his shoulder. He had not asked for it since leaving the ballroom. He found the wall inside the door and put his back to it and said nothing. The room looked at him. He was the senior human representative. He was the closest friend of the being who had built this coalition. He was blind and bloodied and standing without assistance in the specific way that said the standing was a decision rather than a default. One of the council members spoke. An elder of the Sarathi, a species whose diplomatic tradition required that grief be acknowledged before business was conducted. He said Tharvex's name, the way his people said the names of the dead, with a particular elongation of the final syllable that meant something. Russell did not have the cultural framework to fully translate, but understood completely anyway. Russell let the silence after it sit for a moment. Then he spoke, not loudly, not with the cadence of someone delivering a speech to an audience that needed to be moved, but with the flat precision of someone describing a situation to people who needed to understand it. "Tharvex is dead," he said. The shot came from the Arconian side of the room. That is a fact this council will have to carry, and I will not make it easier than it is. What I will tell you is that the Vorath did not come here for a station. If you think this ends here, you're wrong. Varakuan was the announcement. What comes behind him is the message. Nobody spoke. Russell's head moved slightly, reading the room by its silence, the quality of the breathing, the small sounds of species processing something they did not have a framework for. "You have two options," he said. "You find a new framework, or you find new terms of surrender. Those are the only two things available to you right now. I know which one Tharvex would have chosen." He pushed off the wall and left. Severus came aboard through the primary docking collar with 2 aides he immediately sent in the other direction, and no ceremony. He walked the station's main corridor from the docking collar to the Crystal Ballroom because he knew Russell would be there. Russell was standing at the base of the podium, still in the same position Severus had seen on the feed before the arrest, though everything else was different now. Severus stopped beside him. He looked at the blindfold. He looked at what the blindfold covered. He looked at the dried blood on Russell's face and hands and ruined robes. He looked at the podium and at the base of it and at the floor. "You got here fast," Russell said. "I was already moving," Severus replied. Russell made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but it carried acknowledgement and a quiet note of gratitude for something he had expected and counted on. They stood together at the base of the podium, where Lord Peace had fallen, and said nothing for a moment. "Describe the display when we get there," Russell said. "I will." They left the ballroom together. Russell's hand found Severus's arm at the elbow, a light contact. They walked at the same pace without needing to adjust. The tactical display in the station's operations center showed the second Vorath fleet in the flat, cold language of long-range sensors. Mass signatures, approach vector, estimated transit time. The officer who had been monitoring it stepped back when Severus entered and did not return to the console. The council representatives who had followed from the conference room arranged themselves around the edges, watching the display. Severus and Russell approached the display. "Tell me," Russell said. Severus told him. Mass signatures that made Varakuan's force look like a customs patrol. 3 distinct command signatures, indicating 3 tech lords, not 1. Estimated transit time that left no margin for anything resembling preparation. Russell was quiet. The room was quiet around him. The council representatives had heard the description. Several of them had the particular stillness of beings recalculating survival odds and not finding the results useful. One of the Sarathi elders closed his eyes. A Dravathi representative, a species whose biology expressed distress through a barely audible subsonic tone, had been producing that tone since the description began. "Severus," Russell said. "Yes." "We're not done," Russell said. Severus nodded and turned back to the display. He studied the shape of what was coming. He raised his hand and set it against the display, his fingers moving slowly across the cold surface, tracing the incoming fleet. Outside the station, in the dark between stars, the Vorath fleet continued its approach. Patient, massive, certain of what it was coming to collect. Peace had lasted 15 years. War was considerably more patient.
Hey there, space human. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this video. Drop a quick comment and let me know what's on your mind. Or just say hi if you prefer. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Also, remember to check the pinned comment. Trust me, it's worth a look. Oh, and one last thing. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here. Or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.